People thought they were going crazy. First it was the cats, stumbling, spinning in circles, falling into the sea. The fishermen of a small Japanese town called it the dancing disease and laughed about it, until the cats started dying by the hundreds. Then it was the birds, dropping out of the sky mid-flight. Then, in 1956, it was a 5-year-old girl. She couldn't hold her chopsticks. She couldn't walk straight. She couldn't speak clearly. Doctors thought it was contagious. They were wrong. The real killer wasn't a virus. It was in the water, and one company had known it for years. This is the story of Minamata, and by the end, you'll understand exactly how a town found out its harbor had been poisoning it for over 2 decades, and why the people responsible almost got away with it. Minamata was a small fishing town on the coast of Kyushu, Japan, and for most of the 20th century, it had one dominant employer, the Chisso Corporation. Chisso built its factory there in 1908. It made fertilizer, then plastics, then one of the most important industrial chemicals of the era, acetaldehyde. By 1932, Chisso was producing acetaldehyde using a chemical reaction that needed a catalyst, mercury. It was a standard industrial process at the time. Nobody thought much of it. What nobody accounted for was a side reaction. A small fraction of that mercury, roughly 5% of it, was converted into something far more dangerous, methylmercury, an organic compound, one that doesn't just wash away. And starting in the early 1930s, that methylmercury went straight into Minamata Bay in the plant's wastewater for over 2 decades. At first, nothing seemed wrong. The bay kept giving fish, the fish kept feeding the town, and the plant kept growing. By 1951, Chisso's acetaldehyde output had jumped nearly 30-fold from where it started. At its peak, this single factory made up nearly 1/3 of all the acetaldehyde produced in Japan, which meant nearly 1/3 of Japan's acetaldehyde came with the same invisible cost, dumped quietly into a bay that a fishing town depended on for food. By the early 1950s, the bay itself was trying to warn them. Dead fish floated on the surface, shellfish vanished, birds crashed out of the sky mid-flight, and the cats, the ones who ate scraps of fish under every dinner table in town, started staggering, spinning, and dying. Locals called it cat dancing disease. Some areas of Minamata lost nearly their entire cat population. Nobody connected it to the factory. Why would they? Chisso was the town's largest employer, its biggest taxpayer, the reason Minamata had grown at all. Questioning the water meant questioning the only thing keeping the town alive. Then, on May 1, 1956, a doctor at Chisso's own factory hospital filed a report. A 5-year-old girl had been admitted with slurred speech, convulsions, and difficulty walking. Days later, her younger sister showed the same symptoms. Then a neighbor. Then 8 more patients within weeks. The disease had a name now, even if no one yet knew its cause. Minamata disease. Within months, a research group at Kumamoto University concluded the illness wasn't contagious. It was poisoning, some kind of heavy metal entering the body through the food chain. And the only major industrial source of heavy metals anywhere near Minamata Bay was one building: Chisso's own factory. In 1959, researchers tested the bay directly. What they found at the mouth of the wastewater canal was almost unbelievable. Mercury concentrations so high that later Chisso would build a side business just to mine the sludge and resell the metal. That same year, Chisso's own in-house doctor, Hajime Hosokawa, ran a series of experiments. He fed factory wastewater directly to cats. The cats developed the same staggering, convulsing symptoms as the townspeople. Then they died. Hosokawa had his answer. He reported it to company management. Chisso's response wasn't to stop, it was to stop him. He was barred from further testing, and his findings were kept from the public for decades. Then Chisso did something that, in hindsight, is almost impossible to read as anything but an admission. In September of 1958, they rerouted their wastewater discharge away from Minamata Bay and into the mouth of the Minamata River instead. Within months, new cases of the disease appeared in villages along the river that had never had a single case before. The company had, in effect, run a second experiment on people. By November 1959, Japan's own Ministry of Health had concluded in writing that Minamata disease was caused by organic mercury compounds from factory wastewater. Chisso rejected the finding. Publicly, they blamed everything else: military dump sites, agricultural runoff, nothing that pointed at their own canal. And they kept producing acetaldehyde, using the same mercury catalyst, dumping into the same waters for 9 more years. What finally moved Chisso wasn't conscience. It was pressure. Fishermen who'd watched their catches die weren't going to stay quiet forever. In 1959, under mounting protest, Chisso agreed to a settlement. But the deal wasn't compensation in any real sense. Patients, many of them ill, some barely literate in legal language, all of them desperate, were offered small sympathy payments. Buried in the fine print was a clause that mattered more than the payout. If it was later proven in court that Chisso was responsible, the company would owe nothing further. They weren't settling a debt. They were buying silence, priced by how sick you already were. And there was one more twist still to come. Because methylmercury doesn't just poison the person who eats it. Throughout the 1960s, doctors began noticing something they had no explanation for: children born with severe, permanent neurological damage, despite mothers who showed no symptoms of the disease at all. At the time, doctors believed the placenta protected a fetus from bloodstream toxins. With methylmercury, the opposite was true. The placenta pulled it out of the mother's blood and concentrated it directly in the unborn child. Mothers who felt perfectly healthy had unknowingly passed the disease to children who had never eaten a single piece of contaminated fish in their lives. By the late 1960s, patients and their families had run out of patience with quiet settlements. A new group of victims refused the 1959 agreement entirely, and in 1969, they took Chisso to court. The trial lasted nearly 4 years, and the lawyers representing the victims had to prove 3 things: that methylmercury caused the disease, that Chisso's factory was the source, and that the company knew, or should have known, what it was doing to the people who depended on that water. The most damning testimony didn't come from outside experts. It came from Chisso's own executives and former employees, describing internal knowledge that had been sitting in company files since Hosokawa's cat experiments over a decade earlier. In 1973, the court ruled against Chisso. The company was found legally negligent and ordered to pay damages. But by then, the disease had already run its course through an entire generation. Officially, just over 2,000 people were certified as patients. But tens of thousands more filed claims over the following decades, and researchers believe the true number of people affected, many with symptoms too mild to ever be certified, was far higher than the official count will ever show. The company that caused it didn't disappear. Chisso restructured. Decades later, its chemical business was spun into a new corporate entity, while the original company retained the legal obligation to keep paying victims. A slow-motion bill still being settled generations after the wastewater stopped. The bay itself took even longer to heal. Starting in the 1970s, authorities spent over a decade dredging nearly 60 hectares of contaminated sediment from Minamata Bay, at a cost of tens of billions of yen. A cleanup bill for a poison nobody who ate that fish had ever agreed to be exposed to. Minamata wasn't a natural disaster. There was no storm, no accident, no single bad decision on one bad day. It was 2 decades of a company doing the math, weighing what dumping would cost against what stopping would cost, and choosing, month after month, to keep dumping. Nobody woke up one day and decided to poison a town. It happened one waste canal, one quarterly report, one silenced doctor at a time. That's what makes it more frightening than a single villain, not less, because it means the system worked exactly the way it was built to work, right up until it produced a national tragedy. Minamata disease became one of the reasons Japan built modern environmental law. The Minamata Convention, a global treaty to control mercury pollution, carries the town's name today in over 140 countries. The chain here wasn't debt, and it wasn't fear of a number on a screen. It was a canal that fed a bay, that fed a town, that trusted a company more than it questioned it, until trust became the very thing that let the poison spread as far as it did. The people of Minamata never got to choose what was in their water. The only choice left to us now is what we're willing to ask before it's too late to matter. The town that poisoned an entire generation.